Next time on Dragon Ball Z.
And then summoning skill damage was removed from Death Speaker's amulet. What? So today marks the day where we got to learn what the PTR for Season 5 was going to roll out as far as class balance changes, new content, what to expect kind of walking into this, and what the developers were hoping that we would test. But what I would like to focus on very specifically is the expected change in the meta for the Necromancer, because obviously MacroBioBoi. But I gotta be honest with you, I'm not exactly sure what type of energy I want to bring to this video, because I'm mostly just sad. A bit frustrated, pretty upset. But what I want to do is be able to put the changes and what I've calculated at their relative impact across the entirety of the meta as it stands right now into a number that I can hand to the developers and say, hey, if you didn't crunch the numbers, I did. Here's my outcome. And here's why I think you've missed the mark on a lot of these different changes. Now, there are a ton of caveats to put into this, so I'm going to put them up front. Use the timestamps down below. There's going to be 2. It's me saying these caveats and me doing the number crunching, but I need to put these in here right now. We don't know all of the changes coming in the PTR. The PTR is meant to test the changes that the developers have put into place, be able to give them feedback. You're going to hear me complaining a lot because I think that these complaints need to be heard. And if you're not interested in that type of energy, I totally understand it. But the purpose of this video is to critique the changes and give that to the devs, because I think it will be valuable and will lead to a better experience walking into Season 5 for people who have just recently become reignited and re-excited about playing the Necromancer and just how bad they're getting turned over here. And then lastly, these are just my opinions. Yes, I get to send these directly off to the devs. That is a privilege that I get to enjoy as a Diablo partner. But I've been sitting here now for 7.5 hours going over these changes with people who predominantly play the class and who are excited walking into this season and trying to just kind of totally encapsulate how people are feeling about these things. Now, I made it as easy as I possibly could. I took every single change. I calculated its relative expected difference in like our damage output, which luckily on the Necromancer is actually very easy to do since we don't walk good, we don't even run at all, and we don't have mobility skills, except they did add a couple in these patch notes, which is actually like kudos. I have notes on those as well, and just directly translated it to efficiency, gain, and loss. So I made a data table. You know me, I always make data tables. But on top of the data tables, what I did do is I took down every single change that they put into here that can't really be calculated in a meaningful way. It's not like they nerfed this or they buffed this. They just added a new aspect that makes it so that our Blood Mist is kind of a cool mobility skill. So I put my thoughts into this page because not only do I just want to talk about the difference in damage, the difference in output, the expected change in like what pit tier you'll be able to clear, but I want to talk about the things that I think they're doing really well and hit on the topics that I think need to be continued to investigated and built upon as we seemingly approach some kind of balance in this game. So I'm going to include this datasheet in the video description as well. You can read all of my thoughts across all the different things that don't necessarily have a direct one-to-one comparison on damage or efficiency gain. And you'll also be able to look at the total table of builds and how I feel they have either been buffed or nerfed based off what we see in the patch notes as they currently are. When we're talking about any changes to overpower damage, most notably for the blood builds, but in addition to that, Bone Spirit and Blood Wave, which also get to benefit from these various changes. Blood builds themselves have a quarter effective, basically multiplier to overpower buffs, because you don't overpower every single cast, and most of them are expected to overpower once every 3 to 4 casts. So we kind of just cut them down by a quarter, just to say like, here's how much relative damage you're increasing your rotation by. Ironically enough though, both Bone Spirit and Blood Wave get to overpower every single cast, making them the best overpower skills on the Necromancer, and those aren't blood skills. So that's cool to consider. But moving on, let's talk about the builds that are extant here and the ones that we can mathematically prove have changed either for good or worse. Bone Spear, Bone Spirit, Sever, Blight, Shadow Surfer, Infinimist, the 2 new builds. Then we have Blood Surge, Blood Lance, just minions. This is the idea of using like Kalan's Edict and not dipping into the Shadow Blight tech to be able to further increase their damage. Then you have Shadow Golem, Shadow Mages, Thorn minions, and then Surge minions. Something that will be technically slightly better now, and we probably need to pay attention to it. It's not going to be meta or good, but it is slightly better. Across the top, we have the buffs coming to the various builds. And I also included the name of the change that actually indicates where the buff is coming from. So very specifically, we have like the Imprisoned Spirit aspect, a new aspect that effectively gives you a 1.7 multiplier for your Bone Spirit damage, because it will cast twice now, and its relative damage increase on Bone Spirit of a 13% increase. Now I already hear you, Mac. How is it a 1.7 multiplier, but you didn't write 1.7 here? You have to include the fact that this aspect will now take up a slot that was previously taken up by a different option. In this case, on Bone Spirit, it was very specifically taken up by Cadaverous. So as opposed to getting a 50% multiplier after consuming 5 corpses, you'll now gain a 70% multiplier for casting a second, weaker Bone Spirit. In that regard, as long as it works in the way that we expect it to, it's the difference between having a 1.7 multiplier and having a 1.5 multiplier. So you have to think about these changes in ways that aren't just how much damage does it add, but dynamically and incorporating the changes you would have to make to the build to be able to incorporate them. Okay, cool. That's where all these numbers come from. Most notably up here, we have the addition of both the mace and the axe class items to the Necromancer. These will have implicit stats for overpower and damage over time. So you'll notice that we're calculating Blight, a damage over time build, as gaining additional damage because the additional additive from shadow damage over time on an axe will now replace a scythe. They have the same base speed, same base damage, but their implicit stats are different. So that's where we have this inclusion of various damage bonuses. So Shadow Surfer, Infinimist, the OP Blood Wave, Blood Surge, Blood Lance, blah, 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 blah. We also have a change to the focus. The focus is both a nerf and a buff. The focus used to have cooldown reduction as an implicit stat. It will now have lucky hit chance. So for builds that benefited from that cooldown reduction for better uptime on Bone Storm or better uptime on Grasping Veins, it's seen as a nerf. Whereas builds that didn't necessarily need that cooldown reduction, but will now benefit from the increase in lucky hit chance, it's seen as a buff. We now have that minions can overpower. And you might be like, oh my god, this opens up so many doors. Not necessarily. As long as all they've gained is a 3% chance to randomly overpower that we cannot control and we cannot manipulate, that means that we expect to have a 3% increase of the expected damage bonus from overpowering. So on builds that use minions, which none of them are necessarily overpower builds, except for Surge minions, you are gaining a 3% uptime of a 50% damage multiplier and a small amount of the additive overpower damage that you gain. So I'm calculating that as just a 2% increase in damage kind of across the board, with Surge minions definitely benefiting more from it, but the minions on a Surge minion build don't actually do any damage at all. So this is more so just like a consolation prize. Sever, the skill, was just straight up buffed, and Blight, the skill, was just straight up buffed. But if you look at Blight, as far as I'm concerned, you'll notice that I'm calculating it as a 2% increase in damage. How did we possibly get to this number? Blight's damage over time is going from 105% damage to 135% damage. That will continue to scale with additional skill ranks. The irony here being that the Blight Necromancer doesn't care about Blight's damage. The Blight Necromancer only cares about Ebon Piercer's damage. If you've seen my build guides on this, I'm actually one of the few people still recommending Blight ranks on the build, and it's mostly just to stop confusion and questions from coming in. You would actually just get more damage out of having a damage over time additive stat here than the Blight skill ranks, because Blight represents roughly a 1/15th of this build's overall damage output. That's how much stronger Ebon Piercer is than the Blight skill is. So for the calculation here, you'll notice that I have the difference in the damage, be able to calculate that, divided by 15 to get an understanding of just how valuable this increase to the base damage is. And here's where I'll kind of jump the gun a little bit. This is the first thing that I'm incredibly angry about, because they have nerfed the blighted aspect as well as the wither node in our legendary paragon. I'll talk and touch on those in excruciating more detail later on. But the idea is that they have then buffed Blight to compensate for this damage loss, but Blight itself was not actually contributing to the Blighted build's damage output basically at all. It's all the amulet. So because they haven't buffed the amulet's damage, which they shouldn't, the amulet is absolutely broken and needs to be the thing that is actually nerfed here. They have effectively not compensated the build at all. And you'll notice down here that Blight is calculated as losing nearly 70% of its damage output, actually 69% nice of its damage output. I'm going to touch on it later in more detail, but that's how we got here, and one of my major issues with the approach to balance that this patch has proposed. The Bloodwave build basically tripled its damage and will now exist at all. Again, I'm incredibly excited about this. This is just mega huge. Hellbent Commander. They changed Hellbent Commander in a very interesting way that I think a lot of people are probably going to misdiagnose or misattribute to a damage loss or a damage gain, depending on how you look at it. The long and short is that Hellbent Commander will now do less damage, but it will always be active. You no longer have to be close to your minions. On a base minion build, this is strictly a buff, because you were never near your golem and near your warriors and near your mages simultaneously. And if you're attempting to get all of your minions to do damage, this is strictly a buff to Hellbent Commander's output on your build. I calculate Hellbent Commander at basically 50% effective, because you're constantly dodging away from your minions to be able to avoid pit boss mechanics, etc. And it was only in very specifically the Shadow Golem and the Shadow Mage setups, where you only cared about a single minion type's worth of damage, where you could effectively have a better uptime on Hellbent Commander. Whereas on a generic minion build, it was only about half effective. So very specifically for those two minion builds, the Shadow Mage and the Shadow Golem builds, basically the current meta, I'm considering the Hellbent Commander to be a nerf. Whereas for a generic minion build or a Thorns minion build, where you kind of just want to be near all of them, but you never really could be, I'm considering it a buff. Is that exactly accurate to what the game state is now? Probably not, but it's my best estimation of the impact of these changes. Blood Moon Breaches just got a buff. Again, I'm calculating that at a quarter efficiency for Blood Surge and Blood Lance, since you do not overpower 100% of the time. But for Bone Spirit and the new Bloodwave build, it does have 100% uptime, because with Banished Lord's Talisman, you overpower on every single cast. And also for Bloodwave, you're going to be able to overpower on every single cast due to its natural interaction with Rathma's Vigor and being able to pick up Blood Orbs. So hilariously enough, this massive buff to Blood Moon Breaches is the smallest buff that it could be, very specifically on our Blood Necromancers, which I have a note here that touches on the fact that this should probably be a wake-up call for just how hard it is to properly manage overpower on our blood builds, the things that should be the most efficient at getting the bonuses out of this, whereas instead, arguably the strongest build right now, which is Bone Spirit after the changes with the Holy Bolt Elixir, benefit from these changes 100%, and it's not even a blood skill. And I think that that is a massive problem. So now talking about the nerfs, again, Focus Change represents a bit of a nerf across a couple different builds. The change to Hellbent Commander represents a nerf against the current meta minion builds that exist. And then we have the Blighted aspect. Let's talk about the Blighted aspect. Blighted aspect used to say gain 120% damage multiplier. You would put it onto a two-handed weapon, giving you a 240% damage multiplier, meaning that running this aspect onto a two-handed weapon and approaching 100% uptime of the Blighted bonus gave you a total of a 3.4 times multiplier of your overall damage. This is used on Sever, Blight, Infinimist, Shadow Bloodwave. It's also used on the majority of meta minion builds. They have nerfed it dramatically, and I do not disagree with the nerf to the aspect, because it is the single strongest aspect on the Necromancer that always begged the question, should I actually just find a way of triggering Shadow Blight instead of using any other key passive for the purposes of empowering my build? It was worked on Bone Spirit, it's worked on Blood builds, it's worked on Minion builds, and it works on Darkness builds. The only thing it doesn't really work on is Bone Spear, because there's no way to effectively proc it. But people have tried to use it in the past. So in nerfing it, bringing it back in line with the rest of the multipliers that the Necromancer has available to it makes sense. I do not disagree with that. The major problem being that the builds that are currently using it that aren't overperforming were not compensated in a meaningful way. Because now on a two-handed weapon, as opposed to a 3.4 times damage multiplier, it represents a 2 times damage multiplier, which is pretty par for the course for just about any damage multiplier you could put on it. But when you start looking at things like Grasping Veins before they nerfed it, that was already a 2 times multiplier, but it also gave you a 50% increase in your critical strike chance. And all it needed to do was just click Corpse Tendrils, whereas Blighted Aspect required you to do 100 instances of shadow damage, which now that more people have been playing the Necromancer in general, people have come to understand just how difficult it can be to actually trigger this thing. So now it's a hyper difficult to trigger aspect, even though they have buffed how Shadow Blight works, and we'll touch on that as well. But it is a hyper difficult to trigger aspect regardless of the change. And it got nerfed down to be on par with other things that just offer more bonuses for less restriction. The Blighted change, the change just to this aspect, represents a 41% damage reduction on Sever, a 41% damage reduction on Blight. It represents a 37% reduction on Shadow Surfer and Infinimist. It also represents a 33.8% reduction in meta minion builds who currently run the aspect. And I actually think that that's incredibly healthy. We should be hitting the builds which are defining the meta as it currently is now. Why are we hitting Sever with a 41% damage reduction? It's barely nullified by the 42% increase to the base skill damage of Sever, but this build is just getting hit seemingly for no reason because minions and Blight are running this aspect, and their approach to balancing it doesn't come out in the wash. Grasping Veins, another aspect which has been hit in this patch for seemingly its over-representation in the meta of builds, is another huge pain point for me. Grasping Veins used to say 25% chance to crit, 50% damage multiplier when you crit, as long as the aspect has been applied to the target. They've fixed a bug where it was indefinite, so you always gain the multiplier. That makes complete sense to me. But let's talk about the builds that currently use Grasping Veins, because you'll notice that it's seemingly used on every single build. Bone Spear uses it. It always used it. It didn't need the crit chance. It was just the strongest multiplier you could get in that slot. So it getting nerfed slightly in this regard, while absolutely not necessary for Bone Spear, which is like the 6th strongest Necromancer build, I think that that's okay for it to get caught in the crossfire. Bone Spirit, arguably the strongest build right now. Getting nerfed a little bit, absolutely no problem with that. That makes sense. Then we get to Sever. Sever is the 5th or 6th strongest Necromancer build currently. It is underperforming drastically in comparison to the meta builds, and it is desperate for critical strike chance. Now, can it make up the difference? Can it regain this 5% critical strike chance somewhere? Absolutely. Except Sever was so hungry for critical strike chance that not only does it sacrifice your skirmishers sometimes for crit chance just to be able to hit cap, as opposed to gaining the benefits from the shadow damage multiplier from that same sacrifice, but Sever had to use Grasping Veins on its amulet, meaning that it's now representative of an 8% decrease in your critical strike chance. Well, that's not great. That's not nearly as fair, right? But this build, which is underperforming, is now losing crit chance and damage multipliers because it's very prevalent in the meta, because they've made it so that every single Necromancer that wants to hit crit chance cap needs to have Corpse Tendrils and Grasping Veins on their build. So because the builds are weak without it, everybody has to run it. And because of that, it's over prevalent and is now being nerfed. Do you see a problem with that? Well, let's go ahead and talk about the blood builds. Blood builds are even more worse off than Sever was, because Sever doesn't have a ton of aspects that are competing for its slot. It has Blighted, Grasping Veins, Damned, and then sometimes Ultimate Shadow. It can actually get away with running a ton of unique items. Blood builds are forced to use unique items in the form of Shaco, Blood Moon Breaches, Banished Lord's Talisman, and at this point also Starless Skies, and already needed to maximize their attack speed, maximize their maximum life, and also deal with a underabundance of damage multipliers on their build. So now it is harder for them to reach crit cap, even though we got a buff to the Book of the Dead, which was a 5% increase, but now they've decreased Grasping Veins by 5%, meaning that blood builds gained absolutely nothing from the Book of the Dead changes for critical strike chance. This comes out here, just like a net 0 of bonus, and they lost a multiplier. They still have to use Grasping Veins. Nothing else comes anywhere near the total amount of damage that the aspect offers to a build, and now they just do less damage because of that. They were already the worst performing builds on the Necromancer. Even after the changes, they're hard stuck around like tier 117, maybe tier 120 in the pit, and that is on perfect, multiple GA'd, perfect masterwork crit gear, be able to have the stats necessary to eke out enough damage to barely kill the bosses before the timer runs out. That's the discrepancy in power that we're talking about here. And they just got hit because, I don't know, we just don't like that Grasping Veins needs to be run on every single build, but we're not giving us any tools for being able to mitigate the need to run Grasping Veins. Why? I actually don't get this one. Now let's talk about the Wither node. This is to bring Wither, arguably the only interesting thing in the Necromancer's Paragon board, into line with other systems. Wither is an incredibly powerful node. It says that your damage over time effects effectively have a chance to crit. That chance is increased by every 60 intelligence that you put onto your build, gaining a 1% chance of it happening and a 4% increase in the damage. This is now capped at 1200 intelligence. Let's go ahead and look at my Blight Necromancer as a really good example of what you can expect with imperfect gear of what it used to say. So on my Necromancer, again, with imperfect gear, at this point with like GAs and Masterwork critting, you can expect to get over 3000 intelligence onto a Blight Necromancer build, and that's including the fact that Ebon Piercer doesn't have an intelligence roll on it, meaning that we could actually go even higher on other builds. But on my build, where I have a very nice 2600 intelligence, the Wither node says that I basically have a 50% chance of increasing my damage by 222%, so a 48% chance for 222. That means half the time I'm gaining a 3.2 times multiplier of my damage over time, something that can't normally crit, but with Wither kind of can crit. By capping this at 1200 intelligence, that means that the maximum chance that you can to apply this drops down to 22%, and I think the damage drops down to like 150. I did the math, I crunched it, I came up with a number. But the difference in what the build used to be able to get the expected average damage increase from to what it is now is representative of a 44% decrease in damage on Blight. Now, when we were talking about the 41% damage decrease from the Blighted aspect, Sever was appropriately buffed by 42%. Technically speaking, Sever should still be outputting the same amount of damage, except it also got hit by Grasping Veins, but we'll talk about that at the end with the final calculation. Blight did not get buffed by 42%, because Blight's damage is irrelevant to the actual build. Everything is coming from Ebon Piercer. So what we gained was a 2% increase to Blight's base damage, and we lost 41% from Blighted, 44% from the Wither node itself. Not only is this just like lame, because 1200 intelligence on a Necromancer build, you get there basically by accident, but the Wither node actually asked a very important question, which was how much survivability are you willing to give up to increase your damage? Whereas now what it says is just put intelligence onto 2 or 3 pieces of gear, get your maximum bonus from this node, click it, and then ignore scaling intelligence after that. We gained so much primary stat on our gear. And keep this in mind too, this doesn't even include the change that will come to not running as much intelligence on the build. It basically all swaps over to survivability, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I think that comes out in the wash. I'm getting this much survivability, I'm losing this much damage, sure, whatever. But the top end of damage that Blight will be able to put out, the thing it needs to do tier 130 pits right now, it just will not be able to achieve that amount of damage, just straight up across the board. It won't get there. And then the last significant nerf that came in this patch is in the fact that the damage stat, generic damage, used to double dip for dots. This was a bug. This should get fixed. No question, absolutely no issue there. If you take into account how much additive damage you would get if you didn't put damage onto your gear and instead put other types of additive damage onto your gear, this one is not like crazy huge, but it does represent basically a 15 to 16% reduction in expected damage from damage over time builds, because that's how much more additive damage you used to be able to get out of this bug. Are we supposed to be fixing bugs? Absolutely. Should we be compensated for when bugs would reduce the output of builds? Yes, or at least I think so. And it's seemingly in line with what the developers have said in the past about their approach to taking toys away, they will give us toys. This one I do not feel like is actually being compensated in a meaningful way. This is what I think the expected reduction in build output will be on your favorite builds. So let's talk about it. Bone Spear just does 25% less damage. Bone Spirit, the strongest build currently in the season, does 21% more damage, just strictly better. That probably shouldn't be how balance works, but here we are. Okay, cool. Sever, minus 36% damage. Blight, minus 69% damage. Shadow Surfer, minus 68% damage. Infinimist, which was already dead in the water based off the change to how Blood Mist will now not start ticking down its cooldown until after the skill is used. So I think Infinimist has basically just become your Blighted Corpse Explosion build, which is strictly worse than Blight. 67% less damage. The Reap, the basic skill Reap build that doesn't exist yet but might exist, also lost 55% damage here. Overpower Bloodwave, another build that doesn't currently exist, gained 243% damage. That's actually sick. This is probably the thing I'm most excited to test. Blood Surge, and here's the irony, blood builds, which are the least powerful builds currently in the meta, were nerfed the least. Cool, just let that sink in. Blood Surge and Bloodlance both lost near 16% of their damage output. Plain minion builds, a thing that doesn't really exist in the meta anymore because it turns out that Kalan's Edict just isn't good, is just 65% better. Shadow Golem and Shadow Mages are going to lose 44% of their damage output. Thorn minions is 13% stronger, and Surge minions, another build that doesn't really exist, is 10% weaker. So where does this leave me off? Well, the reason why I wanted to crunch these numbers, again, is to create a very easy to digest and foundational explanation of how I believe the builds have been impacted, how I personally believe that video games should be balanced. When we think about a season, moving from season to season, you will have as a baseline what we expect builds to do. You will have overperforming builds and you will have underperforming builds. I think that underperforming builds should be brought up to baseline and overperforming builds should be brought down to baseline. Now, typically speaking, nerfs will hit hard and buffs should hit hard as well. So the underperforming builds will probably go slightly above baseline. The overperforming builds will probably go slightly below baseline. If you were to map this out season to season, you would see a flow. We're going to get real wibbly wobbly with it, just as like a very basic understanding of what biology means and what evolution means. When you have two populations, let's say wolves and bunnies. Wolves want to eat the bunnies want to run away from the wolves. Okay, if there's more wolves than bunnies, right? The wolves are getting really good at hunting the bunnies. These are our overperforming builds. The bunnies that weren't good enough at running away from the wolves will naturally get eaten. The population will go down. These are your underperforming builds. When we move to the next season, there are less bunnies for the wolves to eat. So the wolves that are better at finding the bunnies will stay around, but the majority of the wolves will fall down. The population will go down. Because of this, the bunnies that are better at avoiding the wolves, the builds that get buffed, will perform better, but all of the bunnies will come up because there's less wolves around to eat them. We get the same idea of this wave as we do in like the natural regulation of nature and how populations move. And that's what I think a healthy equilibrium for class balance can be equated to. The things that are better or are on the horizon or are being looked at will perform better. They're going to go above the norm, and then they will eventually have to get rebalanced so that they're brought back into equilibrium. What I'm seeing here is the overperforming builds of minions are being nerfed. I think that that is very valid. I think that's incredibly valid. Now, that being said, Bone Spirit, which is also now overperforming, which we have slightly less data on this because it's only becoming popularized now, also got buffed, and maybe that's okay. Bone Spirit gets to enjoy 2 seasons of being a good build. But then we start talking about Blood Surge and Bloodlance, things that have not been part of the competitive meta, are the worst performing builds, got nerfed in this patch. for seemingly no reason, and we continue to ignore overpowered builds and the issues that they run into, the fact that they're just bad at doing their primary damage output. Similarly, the darkness builds are all getting hit. Why? Because the blighted aspect and the wither paragon node are overperforming, when in reality it's just that minions are now using the blighted aspect, and blight got a unique item that is vastly overperforming the build's base output. When I made my video talking about the fact that core skills don't do damage, I wasn't lying. They just don't. They underperform in every measurable way. But Ebon Piercer exists, meaning blight is overperforming. So it's getting hit so hard that's going to be outputting 30% of its damage. And because of this, Sever, an underperforming build, Shadow Surfer, an underperforming build, and Infinimist, effectively a dead build, are all getting significantly nerfed. And they're not getting buffed to compensate that. Poor Bone Spear. Bone Spear used to be our golden child. Yes, it ran at like top S tier for a very long time. I think it's perfectly fine for it to get brought into balance. But right now, it's like the 5th best build. It was doing 120 maybe before the changes, and probably will get up to about 125, but that's on max gear with perfect GAs and perfect crits. It's also just getting nerfed. I don't think it needs to, but this is one of those things where it's like, okay, sure, you're going to catch a few stray bullets here and there, because not everything can be perfectly aligned. But there is a big problem with what these numbers represent about the overall health of the Necromancer build and how these changes are going to impact them. Like I said, I'm going to send this off to the developers. I think that these numbers can go a long way to be able to better illustrate what I hoped to communicate in this video. And I would like to hear from you all as well. I don't just like spilling doom and gloom. I am incredibly excited about Season 5 because they added a roguelike Hades/Vampire Survivors just like returnal gameplay mode. And I think that's the dopest. I'm so excited to be playing this in Diablo 4. I think that Season 5 is offering a lot. But it's hard to be excited when I think that this is the reality of the builds as we'll see them. So hopefully, 1, the developers pay attention to this. 2, we test these things out in the PTR. I'm either incredibly wrong, which would be the best case scenario, or I'm right, and we already have this great framework to be able to lobby for these changes to be impacted in some way to reverse the damage. Let me know what you think. I'd love to hear from you down in the comments. If you're brand new here and you haven't already subscribed to the channel, toss a like onto the video as well if you appreciated the level of depth that I went into, or if you're just kind of feeling nice and you want to. And as always, I appreciate that you watched this video. I truly hope that it helps. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.